Welcome to PlayStation 5. At PlayStation, we believe in generational transitions, and we put years of work into making them happen. We want you to enjoy the unique benefits of moving from one generation to the next.
I have one! There's no games! There's no games on it! It's a Netflix box! There's nothing!
If you've been around the gaming social media landscape for the last month, you may have been noticing a very alarming pattern going on with many AAA game studios as of late. That pattern being that they are struggling, big time. From employees being laid off, to game releases failing to meet sales expectations, to even said game releases simply failing to be, you know, actual good video games. Basically, besides for a couple of exceptions like Nintendo and Epic Games, pretty much nearly every massive AAA developer and publisher you can think of is going through rough financial problems right now. With one of these massive publishers being arguably the most infamous among the rest, that one gaming publisher being none other than Sony Interactive Entertainment, aka PlayStation. There has been a lot of recently revealed news about the foreseeable future of PlayStation that shows that they are currently going through a rough time right now. From the aforementioned layoffs, to the announcement of no major game releases for the rest of this year, to even the announcement of the PlayStation 5 console now entering the later stage of its life after failing to meet sales expectations, there's simply no sugarcoating it. The PlayStation brand is currently going in a downward spiral. Naturally, with all of these shocking announcements coming from the actual company itself, this has caused a lot of confusion and justifiable eyebrow raises among general gaming fans. How is PlayStation, a brand that felt like it was on top of the world by the end of the last generation only a few years ago, now suddenly in a position where they had to let go of 900 of their employees? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that question isn't exactly a simple one. While it would be so easy for me to basically summarize this entire video as, haha, the PS5 has no games and that's why no one is buying it, thank you for watching my video, subscribe for more, the simple truth is that there is way more to the situation besides that. I mean, the Wii U definitely had games for its time, and yet you saw what happened to that thing. Instead, what I believe is going on is a combination of small problems that have been plaguing PlayStation for years now. Small problems that have been getting worse and worse and are now all coming back simultaneously to bite Sony back. And that is what I want to talk about today. Let's take a look at the issues that are currently ruining PlayStation and explain how I feel like PlayStation has been really taking us and their fans for granted as of late. I guess I should structure this video by going through these issues one by one. I'll even add the Inception noise in between the transitions to make it funny. Issue number 1. Why is everything you make for PlayStation so expensive now, Sony? You know, for the longest time, I always thought Nintendo was the worst of the big three gaming companies when it came to giving their products the most egregious and ridiculously high prices you can think of. $100 for an extra Switch stock, like, yeah, no thank you. But honestly, the way Sony has been handling the prices for PlayStation products in this generation has gone to the point where they are now just as bad, if not worse than Nintendo. Let's paint a scenario where in the United States, let's imagine that I want to get into the PlayStation ecosystem and I have two stupid kids who want to play the latest EA sports game together because they're kids and they're stupid. So how much would I have to fork over? Well, there's the console itself for $500, an extra controller for $70, and the latest EA soccer game for another $70. Which means that even before tax, this would already cost me $640 US. And that's only for the bare minimum for my example. I can theoretically keep going. Such as, what if one of my kids wants to play their game online? You can't play this game online without an active subscription to PlayStation Plus, so you know what that means. There are a lot of annoying factors at play when it comes to saying how much PlayStation Plus costs, so let's just go with a monthly subscription to PlayStation Plus Extra, which is $15 on initial purchase. But what if I or my kids are sick of playing this multiplayer game and want to get some kind of single player experience? Well, time to pick up a copy of Spider-Man 2 to get our fix of that, which now adds another $70 to the total. However, we then notice just how much space these games are taking up, and the PS5 is shipped with only so much storage at our disposal. So it's highly advised that we get ourselves an SSD, which is the only storage format that the PS5 can use to play PS5 games from. So picking one up that is the recommended amount of 2 terabytes is going to be around $180. And since we're going to have two controllers lying around, we might as well have a way to easily charge both of them. It would be annoying to remember needing to hook up a cable for each controller, and it would absolutely suck if one of the kids picks up a dead controller, which is a likely scenario because the battery life for Sony controllers absolutely sucks, so might as well include the official charging dock for $30 more. Keep in mind that my scenario is only taking into consideration just how much all of this costs right now here in the United States. The results from my scenario can possibly be even more expensive, whether it be the console costing way more in other regions around the world, or Sony deciding to once again raise the price of PlayStation Plus for like the 5th time this generation. Basically, it feels like this console only gets more and more expensive as time goes on, which is like completely backwards to how it should be. I know this problem is incredibly subjective. I know what may seem expensive to the eyes of one person may be seen as chump chump change compared to the eyes of another. But for casual consumers, the fact that stuff like the games are now so expensive means that the opportunity for those people to continuously spend more and more on games is getting smaller and smaller. And like, don't you want your consumer base to continuously and consistently spend on your platform? Isn't that like the goal for every single game platform ever? But hey, at the very least the high prices are worth it, aren't they? Maybe it's just an expensive gateway to a platform of many exclusive experiences. That has to be the case, right? Issue number 2. Dear Sony, where are the games? Even though I said at the beginning of the video that the PS5 having very little exclusives isn't exactly the only problem that's going on with PlayStation, it's still nevertheless a huge problem. Many people have been noticing as of late how even though the PS5 has been out in the market for over 3 years, the quantity of exclusive experiences to be had on the console is still shockingly very small. It's so bad to the point that it's basically been a giant meme to look at the Wikipedia page of exclusive games on PS5 and look at just how small the list is. With some people on Twitter even adding insult to injury by comparing the Wikipedia page to other similar Wikipedia pages but for other less successful consoles. And while some of these comparisons are definitely done hyperbole, I mean the page of exclusive Wii U games does contain more games than the PS5 one, but that's not taking into consideration that one of those games in the list is fucking Meme Run. The original argument of these posts still stands. For how long the console has been out, the quantity of exclusive games the PS5 has is embarrassingly small. And I don't think you have to have a very high IQ to understand that not a lot of people are going to be content with paying hundreds of dollars on a console that doesn't offer a lot of unique experiences. And I know some of you will argue that a big reason for why this is the case is that Sony made the choice to make their last couple of game releases cross-gen releases for both PS4 and PS5, and that only now are Sony finally going to go fully in on making PS5 only games. And look, I get it. The PS5's release couldn't have been more poorly timed even if they tried, as Sony pretty much released that console at the time when the world pretty much ended. So I will say it was a morally good decision from Sony to have their big releases from 2020 to now come out for both their 8th gen system and their 9th gen system. But I don't know, I think they waited too long to now start making every game a PS5 exclusive. In their own words, the PS5 is now in the later half of its life cycle, which means that they only have like 4 more years to make games for the PS5 before the PS6 comes out, which I don't think is going to be enough time to grow a large lineup of exclusive games from Sony for reasons that I'll get into later in this video. But you know what, let's just say that regardless if they are exclusives or cross-gen releases, at the very least the recent game releases from Sony are still very unique experiences. Is what I would say if it weren't for issue number 3. Where is the variety? I legitimately cannot be the only one who feels like the variety of games that are coming from Sony Studios are now at an all-time low. The games that we've been getting recently from them, as well as the diversity between IPs, has all felt very samey and formulaic. Here is what I mean. I decided to go to PlayStation.com, go to the games section, then PS5, and just simply count how many of the presented games from their internal studios are either remasters/remakes, sequels, or originals. And here are the results. I found out that out of the 15 total first-party games that the page had, 6 of them were remasters or remakes, 6 of them were sequels, and only 3 of them were original games. That certainly is a ratio, alright. I should stress this now that it isn't exactly the quantity of remakes or sequels that necessarily bother me. If it did, I'd probably not be a massive fan of Nintendo, a company who pretty much have been using the same characters over and over and over again. Instead, what really irks me with these large amount of recent PlayStation sequels and remakes is that a grand majority of these are from franchises and IPs that either originated from the PS4 era or were very prominent in the PS4 era. Spider-Man, Horizon, and The Last of Us are very good examples of this. It always bothered me how certain people online would complain about how Nintendo never focuses on their smaller IPs in favor of only using their big IPs. But, and I can't believe I need to say this, Nintendo has actually improved a lot in resolving this issue in this generation, but more importantly, Sony is now just as guilty of this problem, if not much worse. During the Switch era, Nintendo have made sequels, remasters, and remakes for games from across a variety of their generations, with the oldest one being from the stinking Famicom. Meanwhile, Sony can only dig as deep as the PS3 era to create a remake for this generation. I really think Sony choosing to pay attention to a few select game franchises and only those few select game franchises sort of ended up making any new releases from them feel much less special in a way. It's kind of sad to say, but there was a time where it was incredibly hyped to see Spider-Man or Kratos on the screen in game trailers, but now I can't be bothered to necessarily care that much anymore because it feels like that's all that we've been getting now for this generation. It especially doesn't help that nearly all of the represented IPs now feature games that are very similar to each other. Third-person action-adventure games that push for a cinematic approach in their design with serious and usually heart-gripping stories with over overly realistic graphics, with the only thing that really differentiates them being their primary gameplay loops. This isn't meant to diss on each game that goes for this approach. I actually do like a few of them, but what made PlayStation so great to me is that they did have such a varied lineup of IPs and franchises many generations ago. It is honestly incredible that Sony were able to provide such a great lineup of first-party and exclusive third-party games back in the PS1. Considering that unlike Nintendo during that generation, Sony had to basically start from nothing. This varied lineup of games would also be carried over to the PS2 generation, where we would also see more IPs get introduced. Really, it wasn't until the PS4 generation where Sony saw the critical and financial success of games like Uncharted 2 and The Last of Us from the last generation and went, hey, let's just make more games like that. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing back in the PS4 generation, since there was still some variety when it came to the game releases from that era, but now it's just gotten much worse in this generation. And sadly, it looks like this is going to be one of those problems that's not looking to be resolved anytime soon. Especially when by now you've all probably seen the leaked Insomniac Games roadmap from a few months ago. Look how lame this is. They've basically been relegated to a glorified licensed Marvel Games studio now. I seriously cannot be the only one who feels incredibly depressed just by looking at this. Besides Marvel, they're also working on making another Ratchet & Clank game, which I'm certain will be made as a PlayStation 6 technical showcase, and no actual new IPs from them until the 2030s. Cool. So cool. But you know what? I would accept this change of variety from Sony. Actually, no, that's a lie. I'd still bitch about it. I would tolerate this change of variety from Sony if it weren't for issue number 4. Sony, you're so slow. Due to the nature of Sony's current games always pushing to use the highest end graphics, it means that pretty much every game from PlayStation now has extremely long development cycles. It's pretty common to have each game from PlayStation's big studios now take years on top of years to complete, which plays a huge factor as to why the PS5 has yet to have such a huge catalog of exclusive games. This is also why I don't think Sony has the time now to even try to build a large catalog of exclusive games for the PS5. Once again, Sony has confirmed themselves that the PS5's lifecycle is already halfway done. I don't think that roughly 4 years is going to be enough time for Sony to make more exclusive games on PS5 besides the couple of ones that they've already announced, as well as some very play-it-safe guesses. I think Sony was hoping that third-party developers could help and alleviate the problem by releasing their games in the meantime that they make their big Chungus games. Kind of like how they did back in the PS4 generation. But now some of those studios are also investing equally long development times for some of their big game releases. Just look at Kingdom Hearts, mainline Persona, the Final Fantasy VII remake, or literally every major game release from Rockstar Games after Grand Theft Auto 5.
I got some jelly beans.
But you know what, I'll give those third-party publishers this. In the meantime that those big game releases get made, they also release smaller and less ambitious titles in the meantime that those games get made. PlayStation can't really say that for themselves. For God's sakes, even the other two major console publishers get this memo. Nintendo and Microsoft also produce and release smaller scale games so they can give something for their fans to play while they work on their more humongous games. And these smaller games can not only be really good, but they can also sometimes be better than the big game releases with the long development cycles. Here's a really good example. Bethesda published 3 games last year, and Microsoft were betting their cards on Starfield being the biggest success of the 3 because it was in fact the biggest game. And well, let's just say that the actual best game of the 3 ended up winning last year. Anyways, going back on topic, I really think PlayStation needs to go back and have studios that are involved with making smaller games with some kind of creative originality in them. Because having all of their workforce make these large-scale games and only large-scale games really limits how many great exclusive games the PS5 could have. Emphasis on go back in that sense, because they actually used to have one studio in the previous generation who did that, Japan Studio. This was the studio that was responsible for some of the most creative and experimental games across PlayStation's history. They were also always my personal favorite studio from PlayStation. A studio like them can be really beneficial in this current era of PlayStation. It's just unfortunate that Sony decided that the best course of action on handling a studio that they needed more than ever is to shut them down early in this generation. I also think that Sony being incredibly slow with their game releases also ties alongside some of their recent questionable business decisions as well. Like, I remember around early on in the PS5 generation, Sony really wanted to focus on making multiplayer games to capitalize on the live service gaming craze at the time. But because Sony's game releases are as consistent and as frequent as my YouTube upload schedule, the live service craze has now crashed and burned before Sony could even release any major multiplayer games. Because of this, a good amount of online multiplayer game projects that were in the works at Sony have now gone time cancelled, including the previously announced Last of Us Online game by Naughty Dog and also a multiplayer game that would have been based on Insomniac's Spider-Man. This one wasn't even announced at all. By the time we found out about it, the project had already been canned, so yeah, cool. And hey, I guess while I'm on the topic of Sony's game releases now being only large-scale projects, issue number 5. Why are you spending so much money, Sony? While I'm definitely sure that Sony has spent millions on top of millions on the budgets of their games for years, I think now it's gone to the point where these games are so ridiculously expensive to make now. This is mostly due to AAA games needing much more resources to make than ever before, as well as just everything in general being much more expensive than ever before. While the budgets given to PlayStation's AAA game releases aren't exactly given out as public information from Sony, we can still make a safe guess. Because of that massive Insomniac Games leak from a while back, a ton of information about Insomniac's game releases have been made available to the public, which includes the budgets and even the sales numbers of their games. So let's take a look at the game entries from Insomniac on PS5 so we can take a rough guess as to how much money Sony invests into an average PS5 game. Not like this will take long though, it's only like 2 games. It's been confirmed that Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart was barely able to make a profit return for PlayStation, which is shocking to hear since the game sold a total of nearly 4 million copies. But it was apparently not good enough for Sony since the game costed them $81 million to make. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but like, strap in, it gets worse. Now with Spider-Man 2, that game would obviously cost way more to make than Rift Apart, simply because the visuals of that game are way more intensive and the game itself is also just way bigger. With all of that being said, this game had a budget of $315 million. That's just completely outrageous. I refuse to believe that it cost them this much money just to make the exact same game again, only with slightly prettier visuals and a slightly bigger map. Where did most of that budget go towards? Did it go into Venom and all of his 19 inches? That's the only answer I will accept. In all seriousness though, I feel pretty confident in saying that Sony spending this much money on making games like Spider-Man 2 is most likely the big reason as to why PlayStation stuff in general is now as expensive as it is. A game publisher and developer choosing to make super expensive games that require years to make isn't a problem in and of itself. But the fact of the matter is that in the meantime those types of games get made, that publisher and developer is simply not going to be making any money unless they have external revenue streams. Rockstar Games is so damn lucky that so many people had spent their life savings and probably the grandparents' inheritance on fucking shark cards because now they're in a position where they can focus entirely on making big budget game releases and not necessarily worry on their release dates, which is both a blessing and an absolute curse at the same time. In the case of PlayStation, their external revenue sources outside of game sales are console sales and PlayStation Plus subscriptions. And whatever amount of money that Sony is making from those, it's clearly not enough for them. Because despite Spider-Man 2 selling 10 million copies in the holiday of 2023, which is really good for any video game, it still wasn't good enough to prevent massive layoffs within Sony Interactive. This all looks even worse when you start looking at games like Palworld, which costs way less to make yet sold nearly the same amount of copies as Spider-Man 2. Or how about Super Mario Bros. Wonder, a game that sold equally well as Spider-Man 2 despite that game being released in what's supposed to be the twilight years of the Switch's life and once again was much cheaper to produce than Spider-Man 2. This isn't an issue that could be pinned onto consumers becoming disinterested in the PS5 because it's getting older. This is an issue of a business model simply being unsustainable. Also, why did you acquire Bungie? And why for that much money? That acquisition was nearly 2 years ago. Did PlayStation fans get any benefit from this? Serious question. So, just to reflect on everything we covered thus far, we have a console that cost a lot of money to purchase, with accessories, games, and subscriptions that also cost a lot of money to purchase, with the console itself barely featuring any kinds of exclusive experiences to be had on it by the 3rd year mark, with no signs of any sort of consistent new game releases happening anytime soon. Well, gee golly gosh, I sure wonder why sales expectations weren't met. Actually, you know what? Let's talk about this, because this has really grinded my gears throughout this entire video. I'm gonna go into issue number 6. Sony's give up mentality. I think it really shows just how much Sony doesn't care in trying to make the PS5 the best it could possibly be when the moment that the console is met with one disappointing financial year is to basically say, oh, it's just the console entering the later half of its life. People are losing interest because the console is getting older. It just means we need to release the PS5 Pro or PS6 to renew people's interest. But that's not the root of the problem. Ultimately, there's no one to put the blame on why the PS5 isn't meeting Sony's ridiculously high expectations besides the higher-ups of that very company who have been making these dumb business choices that have negatively affected the way people see this brand. Thinking that it won't matter because they think people will buy into the platform regardless because It's the PS5. You love the PS4, so you gotta buy the PS5.
Plop plop a noop noop a noop.
Honestly, all of this really does remind me of that time when Sony was really struggling during the early era of the PS3. Both that era and this era were bad for Sony for entirely different contexts, but they both started in a very similar way. Sony making dumb choices at the beginning of the generation after being super successful from the last generation and not realizing the significance of their problems until it hits them right in their wallet. But at least with the early PS3 generation, when Sony realized that they royally screwed up, they put in the aggressive effort to fix it. Making the console cheaper, giving it an entire rebrand, releasing a new marketing campaign, and actually beginning to release games that people would want to play and buy the console over. And in the end, they ended up saving themselves and saving the PS3 from being a complete flop. You want to know what I think modern PlayStation would do if they were in the exact same position as they were in the early life of the PS3? I'll tell you what they do. They would just give up. Just look at what happened to the PlayStation Vita. Platform receives a report of stagnant sales once and Sony immediately folds. Sony really needs to step back and restructure the way they handle their business model with PlayStation. Primarily, try to find a way to have players be engaged in your platform by having consistent exclusive releases. Bring something new to the table or bring back forgotten IPs that could really use the spotlight again. Even if those games would need to be made on a smaller budget or not fit in that well with the AAA game releases, just give it a chance. It would bring more exclusives, it would bring much needed variety, and you really wouldn't have much to lose but possibly much to gain if one of those smaller scale games becomes successful. Even when it was ultimately met with failure in the end, Nintendo still tried to make the Wii U worth it by giving it an admittedly pretty good and varied lineup of games for its time. Even when the company was in financial troubles, it was never taken out on the employees. And thanks to a change of approach early on in the Switch generation, Nintendo has now clearly proven that you can get people to buy and still be invested in a console even in its twilight years, let alone in the middle of its life cycle. And the way they were able to do that is providing exclusive, unique, and creatively filled games consistently throughout its entire life, even if there were some hiccups along the way. And then there's Sony, who after announcing that console sales didn't meet their expectations last year, decided that the best idea to go with is to fire a huge amount of their employees while also announcing to their fans to expect no big releases from them this year. Are you seriously punishing your employees, your consumers, the people who actually give you money for not giving you more? Well, I'm sorry that people don't want to invest $500+ on a platform that has no exciting games in the foreseeable future, very little value to it, and the little value that it does have can just be experienced on other better platforms. Is this a joke? Do you seriously expect me and other players to be content waiting for 2+ years just so I can play the exact same games again, only with different, most likely shittier stories? How do you expect an increase in sales of your console when there's nothing for people to look forward to on it besides more of the same shit, as well as continue to invest your money on ways that don't make your platform any better at all? Hey guys, please buy our $200 glorified Wii U gamepad, and while you're at it, please buy our PlayStation earbuds. Go watch The Last of Us TV show, and please watch our Uncharted movie where Nathan Drake is played by MCU Peter Parker. And stay tuned for the $700 PS5 Pro, where we will release even more fucking remasters of the same 2 Last of Us games for an additional price each. I think I'm done. Honestly, at the end of the day, it's just really depressing to see how much PlayStation is struggling right now. I can't deny the fact that Sony's business model in the PS4 era was definitely a huge success in the short term for them for making the PS4 as successful as it was, but that's just it. It was something that worked in the short term. A business model that simply isn't built to last in this current day of age. To give Sony some benefit of the doubt, perhaps the massive layoffs can possibly be a wake-up call for them to finally change things up, especially since this would be the month where Jim Ryan would step down as CEO of Sony Interactive after being in the position since 2019. But I'm not holding my breath. I'm tired of hoping for this brand. I'm sorry if this video was much more of a Debbie Downer than what I usually make, but it's something that's been frustrating me for years now. The reasons for why I fell in love with PlayStation to begin with all those years ago are just no longer valid in this current era of the brand. And that just makes me sad. I've got a feeling that most people will just pass this video off as me being just a hater or being a dumb Nintendron or something like that. That's fine, that won't bother me. I'm confident that anyone with actual brains will at least know where I'm coming from. We're currently living in a very transitional period of gaming. There's a good chance that a game publisher that you knew for years is possibly going to change and adapt into something much different in only a matter of a few years. Which, hey, may be a good thing or a bad thing, who knows. As of now, we'll just have to wait for all of it to settle and see where all of this goes. In the meantime, I'll just continue to enjoy gaming on the platforms that I enjoy doing it the most. All the while, I occasionally remember to look at my PS5, sitting on the floor, collecting dust, constantly having its dim orange rest mode LED light strip on for weeks at a time, and simply say to myself, I miss the old PlayStation. I miss them a lot. Anyways, tune in for next time where I will be talking about a bunch of stupid Mario Party games. My endurance to create original content truly is a laborious one.
I'm telling you now, I have plans that I cannot share with you right now because the haters will sabotage me. I have plans that I cannot